It's God who's put Israel back, and God help anybody who tries to make them divide up their land, or who tries to come against them and attack them, because then it won't be the Israeli IDF that comes against those nations, but it will be the mighty God himself. Thank you so much for joining me again today. I want to pick up from where I left off last week and then just continue. This will be the second one that I do about South Africa, about Israel, and about the contrast between the two nations. And I also want to look at some of the warnings that God gives to nations who stand against Israel. So last time I had ended and was rushing because I'd definitely gone over time. But I was rushing to explain what happened in 1948, and I want to pick it up there. So after the Second World War, where Winston Churchill had led the Allies through the war, and he was a great statesman and a great war leader, and he'd inspired the nation to fight and not ever to be dispirited or downhearted, even though they were under severe rationing and restrictions. But nevertheless, he kept their spirits up. And Jan Smuts had done something very similar in South Africa and was also a great statesman. But after the war ended in 1945, what happened was that these two great men were voted out of power in the elections. I don't know if it was because they were seen as like that people really were in awe of who they were. They both did, which is not strange because it was a long time ago. But anyhow, people were in awe of them. And so I don't know if they thought, oh no, these guys are just too mighty to just be in politics. Or if it was that they thought, okay, they led us in war, but now we want people who will lead us in peace. And in that year of 1948, two amazing things happened. One was that for the first time in 2,000 years, Israel became a nation again. However, even though Germany had been defeated and Germany's allies had been defeated, they were called the Axis powers. And those were the ones that had joined in Japan and Italy, and they were the main ones. They fought with Germany. And even though they had been defeated, there were lots of Nazi sympathizers in many countries, including in South Africa. And there were a group of men with I don't even know if all of them had German ancestry, but in any case, they were people who were also anti-Semitic, and they were also anti the black people, because you need to know that in the Holocaust, Hitler did not just kill Jews. He considered that that people who were inferior they were just a waste of time, and they needed to be eliminated. And among those people were the Romani gypsies. And you know, you've got gypsies in many different countries all over Europe. And you've even got gypsies in America. I know that they had a TV show on My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding or something. I know I watched one or two. But strangely enough, those people, most of them are Catholic. And they really are a very moral nation when it comes to their own personal purity. And the girls have to be virgins when they marry. Otherwise, it's just the hugest disgrace. And they've got to marry other gypsies. They mustn't marry people who are not. But they don't always call themselves gypsies. In England, they're called travellers. So although there is great morality on a purity level, especially for the girls, I think the men have got a completely different morality for themselves, double standards, which we often find. Nevertheless, the morality doesn't extend in other areas. And so, sadly, travellers are seen as people who will just come in, they'll steal. If you've got chickens in your yard, they're going to steal your chickens. They're going to steal anything that isn't tied down. That is the reputation they have. And I'm sure some of it is valid, but a whole lot isn't. But they've got a very bad reputation as being people that you can't trust. So Hitler considered the Romani gypsies to be people who needed to be murdered as well, all black people, also people that were homosexual, the queers. They had to be eliminated. So did anybody who was disabled in any way. Down syndrome children or anybody with Down syndrome, anybody with any form of mental retardation or just mental slowness. They were seen as a waste of oxygen. And so these were all people who were murdered in the Holocaust, not just Jews, but the Jews were the main ones. But the reason for that is that Hitler believed in the superiority of the Aryan race. Now, he gave the name Aryan race to people who were Germanic. They were people who had, like in his eyes, the perfect German look, which was blonde hair, blue eyes, very athletic, and they were actually breeding camps. I mean, I'm just saying it in the most basic way, but they would find all the girls who really epitomized that perfect German look, and then they would find guys as well in the same way, and they encouraged these people to actually have a child together because they believed in breeding out the perfect Aryan race. And in fact, in 1936, which was the 1936 Olympics, this was to be a great showcase for everything that Hitler believed in. And so he had all his athletes, and all these beautiful blonde, blue-eyed athletes were supposed to win everything, but they didn't. And in fact, there was a black man from America, Jesse Owens, and he won everything. I've told about this on TikTok, and I think I might have even told it here, so I won't go into that in any depth. But he wouldn't shake hands with Jesse Owens. Hitler wouldn't, with somebody so inferior. So he didn't just come out and say, I'm not going to shake hands with you. He just wasn't there, because all the winning athletes, the gold medalists, would be taken into the building, and there it was their great honor to meet the Führer and to shake his hand. But he wasn't around when there was an athlete that he thought was inferior to him. And so now all of this was going on in Germany. And there were sympathizers in South Africa who had a similar mindset. It's like, black people are definitely inferior to us, only white people. You know, there was even a thing coming from the church in South Africa, the state church, where they absolutely believed that there was a curse on black people, like it was the mark of Cain, and that they were cursed by God, and it showed up in their skin color. And I've had discussions with them. My mother was Afrikaans, so I'm not speaking, I mean, I'm half Afrikaans. I'm simply telling you the truth, which last time I said is the most important thing, to be a truth speaker and a lover of truth. And so I've spoken to many people who came out of the state church, and where they would say, but Fiona, I know the Bible says they're cursed. And I go, where does it say that? And they'll go back to the mark of Cain. And I'll point out that Cain actually died. You know, Cain's descendants died in the flood. We now have Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, and that was the beginning of the new population on earth. So Cain's mark doesn't actually count. And there's nowhere that it says that it was because people were black. And so I think they get mixed up with an account of the Gibeonites, who were people who were going to live right next door to Israel when Israel came in and took the land that God had given them, which is the land that is currently under dispute, which is the Promised Land. They came in, and the Gibeonites saw that God was with these people, and that just the blessing and favor of God was on them, and they were able to defeat everybody. And they were so terrified of being defeated that they hatched a plan, and it was a really good one. You know, they said that they put on old shoes, and they got moldy bread, and they appeared in rags and with, you know, filthy dirty. And they came up and they said, we live a long distance away. Look at our bread. It's moldy. It was fresh when we set off weeks ago. And look at our shoes. They were new when we started walking. And they used those evidences to point to the fact that they lived a long way away, when in reality they lived right next door. And so it says, you know, Joshua didn't ask God about that. He just went ahead on the evidence of his eyes, which is one of the things we cannot ever do. We've got to actually ask God when we're going to do something. And he made a covenant with the Gibeonites. And he said that if they were ever attacked, Israel would be their allies. However, because they deceived them, he said, but now, he said, the sons of Ham, at least so he said, the Gibeonites are going to be the hewers of wood and the drawers of water for Israel forever. But the people who kind of get that mixed up with other things, go, the sons of Ham or the sons of Cain or somebody will be the hewers of wood and the drawers of water forever, and they make that out to be the black people. And I've said that's not what the Bible says. You're getting two distinct accounts in the Bible mixed up. So it was the Gibeonites who were to be the hewers of wood and drawers of water for Israel forever. However, Israel always came to their aid whenever there was any kind of battle. Oh, I'm about to go off onto a teaching, so I'm not going there. Let's get back to this. So, but the people who were Nazi sympathizers in our country had a very similar view to Hitler because of what was being taught through the church. And I certainly don't think that they were in favor of the Holocaust. I mean, I don't know, they might have been. But somebody said to me once, Hitler had the best idea when it came to the Jews. And I just swallowed hard. And I said, please don't say that. You don't want to come under the wrath of God. But they were definitely Nazi sympathizers. And so one of the first things that they did in South Africa was to institute the system of governance based on the platform of apartheid, which actually legislated that white people could vote. White people were the only ones who could be in parliament. White people were the governors. And that was in 1948. By the 1960s, a man by the name of Verwoerd came into power, and he extended it further. And he actually reduced the kind of education that non-white people were getting. He said, after all, they're so stupid. He said they only need to know how to read and write and do some arithmetic, so that they can add up the money, so that they know how much money they're spending. And he brought in what he called Bantu education, which was an inferior form of education. However, they had really good teachers, because the teachers had gone to university and they'd gone to teachers' training colleges, and they had actually studied and learned. So these people, even with an inferior education system, still did extremely well often. The dreadful thing, I was a teacher, was that white children got all their schooling for nothing. They didn't have to pay a cent. But the lady who worked for me had a number of children, and they had to pay for their education. They had to pay for every book, and they earned a pittance. But that was put into the system, and this is one of the reasons that apartheid was just such a shameful thing. And so I remember speaking at a conference where one of the speakers, it just ripped my heart out. I was the only white person there, and he spoke before me, and he said, and he was speaking about white people. He said, when I was a boy, he said, I'd come to Durban and look for work, and he said, they, being white people, he said, they would kiss their dogs. I kiss my dogs. He said they would kiss their dogs, but they would give us tin cans to drink out of, and sort of metal plates, because you could never let somebody who wasn't of your own colour use your own crockery and your own cutlery, because they could infect you. They were certainly not ever allowed to use your bathroom. And if you ever watched that movie, The Help, which shows what it was like in the American South, they were very, very similar. The Help could never use that bathroom, because, God help you if somebody's bottom touched the place where your bottom was going to go. It was just really horrific. And so that is what happened in 1948. This system came in, and it was there for more than 40 years. But at the same time, sort of as Israel became a nation, it was as if, even though the Nazis weren't in operation any longer, God had, at least not God, the devil had brought something into South Africa where within that system, some of the ideology that had driven Hitler was now driving the Nationalist Party in South Africa. And so it was a big thing to keep the underclasses down and not ever let them think that they were good enough to be equal to a white man. And so that is where so much of the hurt has come into the non-white community. Great hurt. They know the things that kept their parents apart, the Group Areas Act, where only white people could live in certain parts of town, and where I remember when I preached for Kenneth and Lydia Mishu who are the leaders of the ACDP in South Africa. And the first time I ministered for them, I went to Vosloorus, and at that time they hadn't built their building yet. We had the services in a tent. But afterwards they took me to a restaurant, and I was actually so frightened about going to a restaurant with them in case people were rude to them and told them that they weren't allowed in, because that was the kind of thing that happened in South Africa. There is nothing like that in Israel. But anyway, just getting back to the point I made. So although the Nazis weren't around any longer, there was still a group of people in this nation who saw the Jews, the black people, and others as inferior to anybody who was white. And the sad thing was that if you were a mixed race person and you looked very white, or they couldn't actually tell by looking at you what your race was, they would take you to the police station and you would have to undergo the pencil test, which is what they did was to test your hair to see if you had African kind of hair. They would take a pencil and put it in your curl. And if the curl held the pencil, then you were considered not to be white. And so on your documentation, you were classified as non-white. And when you came up to a bench, it would be whites only in Africa. Blankers and nie blankers, white or non-white, had different benches. You weren't even allowed to sit on the same bench. My father said to me that even before apartheid was ever instilled, going right back to the early days in Natal, he said to me, if a white man was walking along a sidewalk, pavement to us, sidewalk to Americans, if you were walking along, and he said, and if there was a black man coming toward you, he stepped into the road so that you didn't have to walk on the same pavement as he was. It was just shocking. Now, to compare South Africa and Israel is a great, great injustice, because there is nothing like that. There is no discrimination in Israel between Arab Israeli and Jewish Israeli. Nothing. The Muslims are free to have their mosques, they're free to have Muslim shops, they're free to operate business on the Sabbath when the rest of Israel, when the Jewish part of Israel closes down. They are allowed to do all of that. And you also found that even in Parliament, they've got Arab parties that are allowed to stand for government, and they sit in the Knesset, which is the Israeli government. There is no difference. And so to make out that Israel is an apartheid country simply because they've got a protective fence up is completely wrong. It's really to protect Israel, because we saw what happened on October 7th when that fence came down, the atrocities committed against Israel. But now, I really just want to end in the last few minutes by reading you some scriptures, because I want to be a speaker of truth. And I'm not going to tell you things that are not found in the Word. And I'm not going to tell you things that cannot be historically verified. Every word I say can be checked up, and you'll find that it's the truth. Okay, so I just want to look at some scripture here. I was going to read you Psalm 83, but it's too long. So please read it yourself. When I read it to Renee, she said to me, "Ooh, that's a fierce psalm." So I said, "Yes, it is. I love it." But anyhow, I just want to move across to Joel. I've got to find him somewhere, the prophet Joel. And where am I? And this is in Joel chapter 3. And this is what it says, reading from verse 1. "In those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem," please listen, "I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will enter into judgment against them concerning my inheritance, my people Israel. For they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land." God help us if we try and divide up the land of Israel, or are implicit in that. Or imagine God entering into judgment with this nation because they took Israel to the international courts in The Hague. And as a matter of fact, they got a judgment against them, which has cost South Africa billions of rands, which they cannot afford. We cannot afford it. And then if we look across at Zechariah, in Zechariah chapter 12, this is what it says. This is the word of the Lord concerning Israel. The Lord who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth, and who forms the spirit of man within him, declares, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. And that means it's a cup. It would be as if you drank something and it so intoxicated you that you couldn't even walk straight. And that's what happens when people come against the fact that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel. When they come against that, it becomes something. It's like drinking an alcoholic drink that affects you so that you can't think straight. And God says, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves. And down to verse 5, he says, Then the leaders of Judah will say in their hearts, the people of Jerusalem are strong, because the Lord Almighty is their God. And in verse 8 it says, On that day the Lord will shield those who live in Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. Now, if you think that the Israeli army is doing something and going into Gaza, all they want is the Palestinians to hand over all the hostages. They want them to stop firing rockets at Israel, and they want them to hand over the murderers and the rapists so that they can be judged in a court of law. That's all they want, and it would stop that very day. The minute they did that, the war would stop. But instead, they are the ones who are implicit in causing the war to continue because they refuse to hand over the hostages. They refuse to stop firing rockets. They refuse to hand over the men who committed these atrocities. So I just pray that everything that I've shared with you today will be something that you understand and it makes sense to you, and that as you read through the Bible, you'll see that Israel gets punished far more than the other nations because they turn against God and they worship other gods. So they get severe punishment. But there is going to be a point in time, and it's already come, when God brings them back, as he said, to their own land, plants them there, and he said the deserts will bloom, and they are blooming. And he said fruit from you is going to go all over the world, and it is. And so it's God who's put Israel back. And God help anybody who tries to make them divide up their land, or who tries to come against them and attack them, because then it won't be the Israeli IDF that comes against those nations, but it will be the mighty God himself. God bless you.